Hey y'all, welcome back to the Book Stamp. I'm Kate, and today I'm going to be recommending my favorite books about space. So, as you can see, I have my NASA t-shirt on today, one of many that I own. I actually worked for NASA last summer, in the summer of 2019, out at NASA Ames in California. So I do feel like I am credible to talk about this subject. I also have a degree in aerospace engineering, and I'm working on my master's in aerospace engineering. So I definitely have read a lot of space books. Up here is like all my textbooks, and if you can see them through the stuff I have covering them, there's quite a few things about space up there. I'm not going to recommend any of those to you today, although a couple of them are pretty good textbooks, if I do say so. Some of them are not. So my love affair with space has existed for a very, very long time. Since 5th grade, when I went to the Space and Rocket Center down in Huntsville, Alabama, I became obsessed with all things space related. Even though now I focus a lot more on aerodynamics in my professional career, I still really love reading space books and books about scientific research and things like that. So today I'm going to have several recommendations for you, sort of for where you are and what you're looking for, fiction and nonfiction, so we should cover all of the ground. So first we're going to talk about some fiction reads that I have really liked that feature space travel very strongly, but are not really science fiction. They're much more speculative fiction than they are like set 2,000 years in the future and wormholes and all that jazz. There's no time travel, no wormholes. It's all from a very realistic point of view, so it still feels very real and grounded. The first of these is The Gravity of Us by Phil Stamper, which after I saw someone who I shared a last name with, it was a gay love story and it featured space travel really heavily. So a quick synopsis of this book is that there's a new class of astronauts that has been brought together, but NASA is using essentially a reality television show to pay for space travel, which as someone who has worked for NASA in the past and knows two things about the US government, this is a highly realistic scenario. I think currently one of the women astronauts that is going to the International Space Station right now has been like contracted with a makeup company to do a 30-minute get ready with me on the International Space Station, which to bring money in for NASA. So it is really very close to reality for that. Our two main characters, one of their dads and one of their moms has been selected as an astronaut. And so while their parents are going through that sort of ordeal of understanding if they're going to be the first person to go to Mars, we really sort of following that trajectory. We have a love story, but there's still a lot of space related shenanigans going on as well, and it is so beautiful. I really, really love the book, and the cover is just absolutely gorgeous. Like, I love this cover so much. The second fiction book that I'm going to be recommending is The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal, which if you're looking for sort of a series to get really invested in, this is a great one. So this is an alternate American timeline story. So essentially in 1950, a giant meteor crashed into just off the coast of the United States of America, essentially decimating the entire eastern seaboard of the country. The capital is relocated to Kansas City, and we follow one of our main characters, Elma, and her husband, Dr. York, who Dr. York is basically the head of human spaceflight for the US government, and Elma is one of the computers, so she's doing all of the mathematical computations by hand for the rocket launches. And we see that Elma was also a WASP in World War II, which means she was a pilot. You're sort of following her drive to become one of the first women astronauts, as moon colonization is extremely important for this sort of decimated US population. So this was one of my favorite books, I think, of this year. I really, really enjoyed it. I think both of them actually are going to make my top 10 of this year. They're both very, very good. So talking about how Elma was one of the computers, of course, how could I talk about space books and not talk about Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly? So of course this book is extremely popular because I think back in 2015, the movie came out, Hidden Figures, with Taraji P. Henson, Janelle Monáe, and the book is actually significantly better than the movie in my opinion. In the book, you really don't have the whole white savior complex that is like the whole middle act of the movie. You really get to focus on the stories of these Black women who were computers back at NASA in the early days of spaceflight. and their contributions are brought to light in that NASA had really erased a lot of their influence back in its history, with a lot of the women not being allowed to be on papers and things that were written for the scientific progress, even though they were key features in developing a lot of the spaceflight missions. So definitely recommend this book. Unfortunately, spaceflight, especially in its earliest days, was really dominated by white men in white button-downs with skinny black ties. That's really the image that you see, but that's not reality at all. And so I've really loved reading a lot of books about women who have made important discoveries that have allowed us to achieve human spaceflight and that had really been shut out of the main narrative for a long time. One of these is Rocket Girl, the story of Mary Sherman Morgan by her son, George D. Morgan. So her son wrote this book after she had passed away, and he was basically on Wikipedia and was looking at rocketdyne, which is one of the important chemical compositions that allowed solid rocket boosters to really function in the way that it's useful to us. And someone else had claimed to invent and to have like discovered it when he knew his mom had done that through her work. And so this book is sort of him trying to make sure that she was remembered properly in history, and it's just a really beautiful story. Her son does such a good job of like telling her story. It's such a deeply human story written from her son, who is now a playwright, I believe. So it's very well written and engaging and just a beautiful story. It's an easy, very interesting read about sort of a very niche subset of the process of human spaceflight. And so I think I really like science books that do that, where instead of taking this broad, overarching, trying to make you understand every single facet of something, you focus very deep in and it becomes a very human story. And I think that's more of what science writing needs right now. So definitely recommend this book. And the last two books I'm going to recommend are much more of your typical science writing, are much of your typical what most people think of with space books. They're pretty much probably considered classics of the genre, or the niche genre, and they're considered this way because there are movies of both of them. But the first one I'm going to recommend is Apollo 13 by Jim Lovell and Jeffrey Kluger, which is Jim Lovell's story that I'm sure Jeffrey Kluger ghostwrote the pretty significant portion of. But this basically tells the story of Apollo 13, which is one of the Apollo missions where they had a pretty severe malfunction on board, and so that led to them having to scrap the moon landing, and it was a really big question if they were even going to be able to make it home alive. If you've seen the movie, the book I think builds the tension in a very different way that I really liked. It's very human. You hear a lot about Jim Lovell's history and how sort of that, I think it makes the themes a lot stronger, so props to the ghostwriter for that. I think the themes come through beautifully in this book, and it is a like space thriller basically. And the last book I'm going to mention is one of my all-time favorites, and that is October Sky by Homer Hickman, which has also been published under the name of Rocket Boys, but October Sky was the title of the movie that came out. Most of the books you find now have the title of October Sky. I think if you grew up in the 2000s, there's no way you got out of middle school without watching this movie at least once. I think I saw it in school 10 times. It was definitely a popular choice. This book covers the story of Homer Hickman, the author, as he grew up in a West Virginia coal mining town and decided that him and his friends were going to learn about and build rockets. And so it's basically just the story of their childhood, overcoming the barriers of growing up in a coal mining town. It's just such a beautiful, like, coming of age story, and it's just one of my absolute favorites. I think everybody should read this book. Alright, so those are my recommendations for space books. I think I covered a couple different types, so hopefully there's something in there that really caught your eye and you want to read. Please drop a comment down below if you've read any of these books or have any other space books you've read that you just really loved. Thanks for hanging out, y'all.